But just what was this invasive opinion? Whose views did the Byzantines begin to value? Who was able to so influence their minds that they began to commit such suicidal mistakes one after another? It's hard to believe that such enormous reverence and dependence could have developed with regard to the same once barbaric West, which had for centuries so enviously and greedily looked upon Byzantium's wealth, and then coldly and systematically grew fat upon its gradual dissolution. Byzantium was a unique state which differed from both the East and the West. Everyone recognized this fact. Some were exhilarated by it, others hated this independence, while others felt oppressed by it. Be this as it may, Byzantium's difference from the rest of the world was an objective reality. First of all, Byzantium was the only country in the world which stressed over a huge territory between Europe and Asia, and its geography was already a large contributing factor to its uniqueness. It's also a very important fact that Byzantium was a multinational empire by nature, in which the people felt the state to be one of their highest personal treasures. This was entirely incomprehensible to the Western world, where individualism and personal self-will had already been raised to the status of sacred principle. Byzantium's soul and its meaning of existence was orthodoxy, the unspoiled confession of Christianity, in which no dogmas had changed essentially for 1,000 years. The West simply could not endure such demonstrative conservatism, called it undynamic, obtuse, and limited. It finally began with grim fanaticism to demand that Byzantium modernize her whole life in the Western image. First of all, in the religious, spiritual spheres, and then in intellectual and material spheres. With respect to the uniqueness and particularity of Byzantium, the West, despite its occasional raptures over Byzantine civilization, pronounced the sentence: it must all be destroyed, if necessary, together with Byzantium and her spiritual inheritors. Not a bad organ, also invented and created in Byzantium. In the 9th century, it was brought here to Western Europe, and from that time on, as you see, it has taken root. Of course, it's senseless to say that the West was to blame for Byzantium's misfortunes and fall. The West was only pursuing its own interests, which is quite natural. Byzantium's historical blows occurred when the Byzantines themselves betrayed their own principles upon which their empire was established. These great principles were simple and known to every Byzantine from childhood: faithfulness to God, to his eternal laws preserved in the Orthodox Church, and fearless reliance upon their own internal traditions and strengths. For hundreds of years, Byzantine emperors, both wise and not so wise, successful governors and inept commanders, saints on the throne and bloody tyrants, when faced with a fateful choice, knew that by following these two rules, they ensure their empire's ability to survive. In the Holy Scriptures, which every Byzantine knew, this is stated very specifically. I call heaven and earth to witness before you this day. I have offered you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, that ye may live, and your descendants also. In Byzantium, after the end of the 13th centuries, two parties emerged. One called for reliance upon the country's internal strengths, to believe in them unconditionally, and to develop the country's colossal potential. It was prepared to accept Western European experience discriminately, after a serious test of time, but only in those cases where such changes would not touch the fundamental basics of the people's faith and state politics. The other party, pro-Western, whose representatives pointed to the indubitable fact that Europe is developing more rapidly and successfully, began to proclaim more and more loudly that Byzantium has historically exalted itself as a political, cultural, and religious phenomenon, and to demand a root-level reworking of all state institutions in the image of the Western European countries. Representatives of the pro-Western party, secretly or more often openly supported by European governments, held an undoubted victory over the imperial traditionalists. Under their guidance, a series of important reforms took place, including those economic, military, political, and finally ideological and religious. All of these reforms ended in total collapse, and led to such spiritual and material destruction in the empire that it remained absolutely defenseless before its eastern neighbor, the Turkish Sultanate. First of all, the pro-Western party began to re-evaluate its fatherland's history, culture, and faith. However, instead of healthy criticism, they offered only destructive self-abnegation. Everything Western was exalted, and everything of their own was held in contempt. Byzantine history was distorted, faith and tradition were mocked, and the army was degraded. The whole of Byzantium began to be painted as a sort of universal monster. The wealthy Byzantine younger generation no longer studied in its own country, but rather left to study abroad. The best minds of Byzantine science emigrated to the West. The state ceased to give them the proper attention. Emperor Theodore II foretold, "Rejected science will become our enemy and will take up arms against us. It will either consign us to destruction or turn us into barbarians. I write this in a state of gloomy melancholy." The emperor's presentiment did not deceive him. During the final fatal attack on Constantinople, a brilliant metal-casting scholar, a Hungarian named Urban, offered to create for the emperor large artillery armaments, which could sweep away the Turkish troops. But treasury was empty, and the rich of Constantinople did not give any money. Not having received payments, the insulted Urban offered his services to Sultan Mehmed. The Sultan seized the opportunity, which would give him the capability to destroy the city's invincible walls. He provided unlimited funds and began the project. Finally, the canons of Urban, the best student of the Byzantine ballistic school, decided the empire's fate.